This is the Issachar Award. And it says, presented to David Barton because they understand the times to know what we ought to do. 1 Chronicles 12:32 and Isaiah 62:6-7. I want to read the Bible verses that go with that. Of the sons of Issachar, who had understanding of the times to know what Israel ought to do, and their chiefs were 200, and all their brethren were at their command. Also Isaiah 62:6-7. I have set watchmen on your walls, O Jerusalem. They shall never hold their peace, day or night. You who make mention of the Lord, do not keep silent, and give no rest till he establishes, until he makes Jerusalem a praise in the earth. God bless you for the work you do. David, can we get a picture really quickly?
Absolutely, brother.
And then we want to hear what the Lord has laid on your heart to share with us today.
I get to share with you some this morning, and in doing so, I want to mention a word that Jim Garlow mentioned. Jim's a good friend. And we've seen the election of Donald Trump, what happened with that. It was a surprise to many people, the way that it turned out. And it's particularly been a surprise that in the last 6 weeks, he has now, from the media on the left, earned the, thank you very much, he's earned the name of theocrat. Now, I got to remind you, 3 months ago, a whole lot of folks were saying, man, the most unchristian guy we've ever had. And now the media is saying he's a theocrat. Every week since he was elected, I've been called to Washington, D.C. to meet with them on all sorts of issues. I just got back from D.C. yesterday. It looks like we're going to be able to finish a religious liberty measure we first introduced 16 and a half years ago. There's stuff going forward. Stuff going forward that none of us thought would ever see the light of day again. So there's a lot going on. But with that, I have to say that it really is a reprieve. It hasn't changed the direction of the nation. It has simply put the nation on pause. We've been in decline for a good bit, and this is a pause button. I want to show you part of the decline. I'm very blessed to do a lot of stuff with George Barna. George, good friend. He heads the American Faith and Culture Institute, and he and I recently did a book together on the condition of America, where we are. And George comes out with new polls every 2 weeks. Really interesting stuff. He is focused on the condition of the church right now, where we are. I just want to show you some of what he's showing us. Right now, 2 out of 3 Christians believe that there is no absolute truth. Now, Trump's not going to fix that. So that's why I say it's a reprieve. If we don't get the church in order, it doesn't matter what Trump does up top, because if 2 out of 3 Christians don't think there's moral absolutes, and by the way, it's 4 out of 5 when it comes to millennials that believe there's no absolute truth. And that's the future we're looking at. One of the things that George points out is out of the 70 moral behaviors that they study, he says when we compare Christians and non-Christians, we rarely find substantial differences. So in 70 moral categories, we cannot see a difference between Christians and non-Christians in their behavior overall, by and large, in the nation. Give an example. The president has moved to do some things to defund Planned Parenthood. As we were there yesterday, one of the things we're working on is how to get that money back to states that President Obama tied up and said states can't defund Planned Parenthood. I think we'll get that done. But the reason that Planned Parenthood exists is not because of Roe v. Wade. It is because of Christians. Currently, right now, 76% of Protestants do not want to see Roe v. Wade overturned. You have 65% of all abortions every year are performed on professing Christians, 200,000 abortions a year on born-again Christians. It is Christians that keep the Planned Parenthood business going. It is Christians that keep abortion going, or professing Christians. When it comes to homosexuality, we have 27% of active homosexuals who say they're born-again Christians. Now, we'll point out that's impossible. 1 Corinthians says that homosexuals will not enter the kingdom of heaven. You can't be a homosexual and be born again. It doesn't work. But see, this is where our thinking is right now in America as far as Christian faith and Christian behavior. So where we are at this point, George is now looking very extensively at churches, and so every day he'll call around 500 churches a day. There's 344,000 senior pastors in America. Call 500 a day, ask them 5 or 6 questions, and we currently know that right now what we have is 72% of churches and pastors in America say they don't believe the Bible. Now, that's 3 out of 4 churches who say, I don't think the Bible's right. I've got my own stuff, I believe. What that does mean is about 28% that do believe the Bible. That means about 100,000 churches, and that's enough to save a nation, easy. So out of that 28% that's there, what then happens is ask them about 24 or so current issues. Do you think the Bible talks to things like immigration? Does it talk to marriage? Does it talk to life? Does it talk about the rights of conscience? Does the Bible talk about all these things we're facing right now? And between 91 and 97% of Bible-believing pastors say, yes, the Bible absolutely addresses the things that we face right now today. Next question, are you going to cover any of those things from the pulpit? 90% of Bible-believing pastors say they will not talk about any of those things from the pulpit. So when you have 28% of pastors who do believe the Bible, but 90% of those pastors say, but I'm not going to talk about that stuff from the pulpit, what you're looking at is 2.8% of pastors in America actually will talk about current issues from a biblical perspective. Now, that's not going to shift much of the culture, which again is why Trump is not going to be the solution for this if the church doesn't get its act together and start addressing the issues that are going on around us and giving people the right way to think, a biblical way of thinking on that. So George came out this week with a new poll, and it shows in that poll that we only have 4% of millennials that have a biblical worldview. So what that means, that's the future of the pulpit, that's the future of politics, this is the future of everything that goes on, and you're talking about only 4% of that group has a biblical worldview. So that's where the real work is in front of us, and that's where we have to do a lot of work, and if we're not careful, we'll be exactly like Europe, and our churches will be great museums. And that's what they will be. They will not be places where people go to worship. They will be, because right now the fastest growing religious affiliation in America is NONES, nuns, those who have no affiliation at all, and with millennials it's the same way. So that's why at this point we have a reprieve, if we can do something with it. Jim said 30 months, I think that's probably about right. I would probably say more like 20 months. I think if some significant shift does not happen before the next election, then I think things will turn further south. I'm an optimist, and so I'm not meaning to sound pessimistic, and I'm not, because I think things can be turned back in a very good direction. I want to take you back into history for a moment. Alexis de Tocqueville came to America in 1831. 1835, he came out with the book Democracy in America. It is from that book that he talked about how different America was, that everywhere he went, he saw faith everywhere. He said we had a religious society for everything. He said in France, I'd always seen religion and politics march in opposite directions. He said, but in America, they're intimately linked together. He said religion must be considered the foremost of their political institutions. And so in that book, he talked about how different we were, and he's the one who came up with the phrase American exceptionalism. He's the one who said America's exceptional. I don't think any other nation will attain to what America's attained to. Now, American exceptionalism is covered today in some textbooks, and when you say who's responsible for it, and you saw earlier, I'm appointed in a lot of states by state boards of education to do history standards. When you say who's responsible for this unique nation that we have, invariably we will go to political leaders like George Washington, we will go to political leaders like Thomas Jefferson and John Hancock and John Adams, and all that's fine. Founding fathers had a huge role in America, but the difference is that if you had asked them 200 years ago who's responsible for America, you would have gotten a different answer. Now, we're very blessed. We own about 100,000 documents from before 1812, so I own thousands of their handwritten documents. 1818, a young historian, Hezekiah Niles, he's the millennial of their day. He did not live through the revolution. He enjoyed the benefits of it afterwards. He's a young guy. He's doing a history book. We actually have his history book, came out in 1822. He went to Old Man Adams and said, 42 years ago, you were in the American Revolution. Now, we enjoy the benefits of that. Tell me, who were the key people in the American Revolution? Who were the key influencers? And John Adams said, you want to know who's responsible for what you're enjoying today? He said, well, right up top, you got the Reverend Dr. Samuel Cooper. Of course, there's the Reverend Dr. Jonathan Mayhew. Ooh, don't forget the Reverend George Whitefield. And you got the Reverend Charles Johnson. He starts going through and listing preachers. Now, that's not who we study in history today. Now, Adams was there, saw it, said, you want to know who's responsible? Start looking at all these preachers. See, we don't cover preachers whether they're white or black. I mean, who in the world today covers anything about Richard Allen, or who covers Absalom Jones or John Moran or Lemuel Haynes? I mean, we don't know these guys, and these are all huge guys in the American founding. Huge. Let me just give you one example. This guy right here is Harry Hoosier. Harry Hoosier was part of the Great Awakening. He preached in there with Bishop Asbury and Bishop Coe, and he drew larger crowds than the other guys did. Benjamin Rush, signer of the Declaration, heard him preach. He said, he's the greatest orator I've ever heard. Well, Benjamin Rush is in Congress. He's heard Patrick Henry and all those other guys. He said, no, Harry Hoosier, the greatest orator I've ever heard. He said, but Hoosier didn't want to preach where everybody else preached. Hoosier wanted to go to as far west as he could go. He wanted to get out with the really wild guys on the frontier, the rendezvous that they had, the frontier mountain men. And so he went as far west as he could go. And by the way, the name Hoosier should sound familiar to you, Indiana. Indiana was as far west as you could go at that point. So he went as far west as he could go. And as he's preaching and people get converted, their friends would look at him and say, what happened to him? He's one of those Hoosier guys. I wonder how many people in Indiana know they're named after a black evangelist. Probably nobody. But see, that's the influence of preachers that we don't even see today. We don't cover black history worth a flip today in schools at all, and especially if it's wholesome stuff like Harriet Hoosier. So John Adams, why would he point to preachers and say these are the guys responsible? It's because if you look at the Declaration of Independence, every single right set forth in the Declaration of Independence had been preached from the American pulpit prior to 1763. What that means is you should read the Declaration of Independence as a listing of sermon topics. See, this was done back in the Great Awakening time. The Declaration of Independence is sermon topics? Absolutely. And this was known for a number of generations. As a matter of fact, John Adams talked about how our pulpits have thundered, and that was the word he used. And we own thousands of those sermons out of the Great Awakening, first and second Great Awakening, out of the American founding. And people used to know what was there. As a matter of fact, this man, Bishop Charles Galloway, is a church historian. In 1892, he wrote a book on the American Revolution and the role of the preachers in it, and this is the way he described those preachers. He said, mighty men they were, men of iron nerve and strong hand and unblenched cheek and heart of flame. He said, God needed not reeds shaken by the wind, nor men clothed in soft raiment, but he needed heroes of hardihood and lofty courage, and such were the sons of the mighty who responded to the divine call. Now, I don't think there's a snowball's chance that the New York Times would describe preachers in that rhetoric today. But that's the way they were described back then. These were guys with guts and courage, and they were the leaders, and they're the ones who shaped the culture, and that was the way we knew it. And here's the type of sermons we had. These are sermons that came out of the Great Awakening. You know, the first Great Awakening went from 1730 to 1730, George Whitefield and Samuel Davies and Jonathan Edwards. The second Great Awakening went from 1801 to 1878, and you got Lorenzo Dow and Charles Finney and Charles Clay and all these guys that were in it. And the sermons that were preached include things like this. This is a sermon preached in front of John Hancock and Sam Adams as the governor, lieutenant governor of Massachusetts, in front of the entire legislature of Massachusetts. For 170 years, we opened legislative sessions with sermons. Here's a sermon on elections. For 230 years, we preached an election sermon every single year, not every other year, every year, because God was the one who ordained civil government. So that's why election turnout used to be 100% in America. I can show you for a number of centuries that 100% is where we were on election turnout. Here's a sermon on judges. That's a big deal. It's a big deal. We're looking at Neil Gorsuch and what he can do. There's 104 judicial vacancies right now. What kind of judges do we want? Well, let's go to Ezra 7:24, where it says, appoint judges who know the laws of God. That's a good place to start. The Bible has so much to say about judges. That's why we had sermons on them. We had sermons on earthquakes. Whatever was in the news, we wanted people to see the biblical view of that. This is preached by the Reverend Dr. Jonathan Mayhew, one of the guys that John Adams singled out. Here's a sermon on homosexuality, one of the sermons nobody likes to preach today because that might offend somebody. I got to point out, Jesus did a great job of offending people all the time. It's not what he tried to do, but he always spoke the truth. And when you speak the truth, people are going to get offended. You're not trying to hurt them. You're trying to tell them the truth. And that's what we used to do. We used to handle anything that was in the news. Here's a sermon, for example, on marriage. It was a law that was passed in New Hampshire. The Second Great Awakening. Here's a sermon on solar eclipse. Sermon preached out of Amos. Whatever was in the news, we're talking about from a biblical perspective. A lot of verses in Amos on solar eclipses, lunar eclipses. Here's a sermon on the infirmities and comforts of old age. Not a popular sermon topic, but it's certainly something that was covered. Here's a sermon on the education of children. What should schools be teaching? What should we do with our kids? How should we educate them? Here's a sermon on the military, religion and patriotism. This was a deployment sermon, actually, 1755, preached by the Reverend Dr. Samuel Davies. This is a sermon on railroads. It was a look at biblical view of transportation, because railroads, 1851, that's a pretty big deal. So what's God say about transportation? Here's a sermon preached in front of the legislature of Virginia. Notice the title up top, The Sinfulness and Pernicious Nature of Gaming. gambling, lotteries, etc. This is what we were doing. This is a Great Awakening sermon, by the way, 1751. This is out of Virginia, which was the heart of the Great Awakening. Here's a sermon on medicine and health care. Here's a sermon on the voice of warning to citizens in the election president of the United States. We dealt with issues. Whatever was in the news, we dealt with out of the pulpit. That's why we had backbone and courage. We shaped the way the nation thought. At this point in time, again, only 2.8% of Christian ministers are willing to address the things that are in the news, shape the way the nation. If you want a revival, this is what revival sermons look like. They're very practical, they're very specific, they address the issues of the day. Now, where we are right now, one of the things we did with George was we said, do Christians today even want to hear this kind of stuff? And so what George did was he said, let's see. And he called, he did a big poll in this thing and found that there were 150 issues that Christians who attend church today, Bible-believing Christians, this is out of the 28% of the churches who believe the Bible, polled their people, and 150 issues they said they want to hear about out of the pulpit. Well, 150, that doesn't mean they think every issue is the same importance, so we had them rank it. Number 5, if you think it's vitally important, you rank it number 4. If you think it's very important, number 3. If it's important, number 2. If it's kind of important, number 1. If it's not very important. And what we found was there were 14 issues where the 70% of churchgoers say, I think it's vital that I hear this issue out of the pulpit. Now, I'm going to show you 12 of the issues because that's what fits on the screen, but there's 14. You can go to wallbuilders.com, you can see the poll that George did. These are the top issues that Christians want to hear from the pulpit. 91% of Christians said, we think it's vital that we hear about beginning of life, right to life, conception, adoption. You mean Christians aren't pro-life? No, that's not what I mean. What you find is in polling, there's 3 political entities. You can say you're conservative or liberal or moderate. And there's only 3 states in the United States where that liberals outnumber conservatives. Now, you would never know that listening to the news. Only 3 states where more people say they're liberal than say they're conservative. In most states, it's a 2-to-1 conservatives outnumber the liberals. What we find is liberals and moderates are very open about speaking their opinion. They'll tell you exactly what they think. Conservatives won't tell you their opinion until they feel like they've mastered it. See, they want to make sure that they're not going to tell you something that's not true, and so they want to make, so what they're doing is they're asking for apologetics. You know, the abortion people keep saying, you guys only care about life inside the womb. You don't do anything once it's outside the womb. So talk to me about adoption and unwed mothers, and I'm Protestant, not Catholic. I don't understand the issue with contraception, so what's that all about? See, they're wanting apologetics. So what they're asking for is equip me so I can go out in the culture and fight back on this stuff. I don't know how to answer it. It's not they're not pro-life. They want to be equipped by the pulpit. Here's a second, religious persecution and liberty. Number 2, 86% want to know about our personal duty, what's the government's duty, what's the church response, and what are the global conditions. All of those are covered in the Bible. The church response is different from the government's response, different from the personal response. Number 3 was poverty. Tell me about the government's role in poverty. What's the church's role in poverty? Tell me about homelessness and hunger and dependence. See, these are the things they get hit with. Critics hit them with this, and they don't know how to answer this. Number 4 on the list, 83%, cultural restoration. Talk to me about appropriate morals, law. Can you legislate morality? Talk to me about values and norms and self-government. Number 4, sexual identity. Same. See, this is the deal where we're losing to millennials. Well, if 2 people love each other, why can't they get married? I don't know how to answer that. Tell me how to answer that, preacher. See, we in the Christian community are not giving the apologetics needed to be able to push back against what the other side does, and our people don't want to talk about it until they feel like they've mastered it. So what they're begging for is equip me. I would talk about these values if I knew what I would say. Number 6, Israel, its role in the world, Christian responsibility to Israel, U.S. foreign policy toward Israel and its enemies. Number 7, this is the kind of stuff I do, Christian heritage. They want to hear this kind of stuff out of the pulpit. Tell me why it's important that we know our heritage. And what does that mean for us today? Number 8, the role of self-government. Give me a biblical view. Give me the church-state relationship that's supposed to exist. Personal responsibilities, limitations. Number 9, bioethics. Tell me about cloning, euthanasia, genetic engineering, cryogenics, organ donation. So, see, all of these are the top 12 issues that Bible-believing Christians are asking churches to address. Now, what we found in the polling is churches are not going to address this. Again, 90% of Bible-believing pastors said they will not talk about this stuff out of the pulpit. So what happens is, if you remember, just before Jesus went back, he talked to his apostles, particularly Peter, and said, Peter, feed my sheep. And this is where we are in the church today. We should be feeding the sheep, and I raise sheep. I'm a cowboy from Texas. We got the horses and the cows and everything that goes with. Animals are extremely good at telling you what they need. If it's a trace mineral block, if it's a mineral block, if it's a salt block, they let you know. They communicate very well on and our sheep are telling us, feed me. These are the top 14 issues I want you to feed me. And we're saying, no, we're not going to feed you that. And that's not the right response. So if church is not going to step up and do this, this is where the NRB really has to fill that void. We have to start equipping Christians to be able to take back the culture, because we do have a reprieve right now. But if we don't change the way that Christians think and get them to talk about these issues, because again, in polling, there's more of us than them. We just don't know what to say about it. This is where we've got to step up and make a real difference on this. It's time to really create a biblical worldview and get back to where we can shift the culture. We have a reprieve. We have a House and a Senate and a president willing to do pro-life stuff, religious liberty stuff. They're willing to do things that we've wanted for a long time. But if we can't come under them with the people and really build this up with the Christians that we have, it's going to be a long, hard fight. So let me encourage you, be bold, be courageous, address the culture. If it's in the news, take the Bible and say, here's how you deal with that. We need to give apologetics to our people. God bless you. Thanks for letting me share with you.
Amen. Thank you, David Barton.